Many people have rightly acknowledged that you were prescient about the risk of this war long before other people gave it the credence maybe that it was due. What did you see in the earlier part of the last decade that led you to believe that Russia and Ukraine were on a path to war?
Well, I believed from 2008 forward, when NATO said that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO, that this was a prescription for really serious trouble. And the crisis over Ukraine broke out in February 2014. And at that point, I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, and I also wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying it was the NATO decision to include Ukraine in that alliance that was the main cause of the problem. And I said that if NATO, and here we're talking mainly about the United States, doubled down and continued to push to incorporate Ukraine into NATO, that it would blow up in our face. And the reason is that for the Russians, and it's not just Vladimir Putin, it's virtually every member of the Russian elite, the idea of Ukraine in NATO is an existential threat. As Bill Burns, who's now head of the CIA and was the American ambassador in Moscow in 2008 said, this is not simply the brightest, this is simply not a bright line. It is the brightest of red lines for the Russians. And of course, what we're seeing today is proof that Burns was correct.
You will hear an argument tonight, no doubt, that Ukraine was effectively overruled for ever joining NATO, that Putin was provided with security guarantees informally by the Chancellor of Germany and others that they would use a veto to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, and that Russia had assurances. They understood that formal membership, a path to NATO membership, was not on the table. So explain to me this perceived disconnect between what you feel was a perception on the Russians' part of an existential threat, Ukraine as a member of NATO, versus possibly an alternate history or an alternate view there, that was never going to happen, and that this is just an excuse that Putin has used to wage a war of aggression.
Simply not true. The evidence is overwhelming that the argument that you're making is wrong. And in fact, on a number of important occasions and in important documents during the course of 2021, the United States reiterated that it was explicitly committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. Moreover, we were making Ukraine, over the course of 2021, and even before that, a de facto member of NATO. We were arming the Ukrainians, we were training the Ukrainians, and we were actually running training exercises like Operation Seabreeze with Ukrainian military forces. So Ukraine was well on its way to becoming a member of NATO. And again, as I said initially, we made it explicitly clear in documents that are public that we were fully committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO. So the narrative that you describe, which is definitely the narrative in the public, simply is at odds with the facts.
Good. Well, we will explore that narrative in the debate tonight. Talk to us a little bit about your philosophy about international relations, because you're considered one of the world's most prominent realists when it comes to your view of how nation states and particularly great powers interact. If I were to ask you, what is the core insight of realism when it comes to this war? What would that be?
Well, my argument is that Russia, as a great power, is very concerned about its neighborhood. The same way the United States is concerned about its neighborhood. And here we're talking about the Western Hemisphere. As all Canadians know, the United States has the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine says that no other country in the Western Hemisphere, including Canada, is allowed to form a military alliance with a distant great power and then allow that distant great power to put military forces in the Western Hemisphere. This, of course, was the principal cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Well, the Russians are also a great power, and the idea that NATO can march up to Russia's border and incorporate Ukraine into it is simply unacceptable to the Russians for the same reason it's unacceptable for the United States, for the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba. In other words, great powers care greatly about the spheres of influence around them. And Ukraine fits very neatly in this category for the Russians. The other thing that you want to remember about great powers, and this includes the United States of America, is that great powers are ruthless. When great powers think that their security is being threatened, you do not want to underestimate how aggressive, how nasty they can be, how brutal they can be. So what you see the Russians doing in Ukraine is, in my opinion, not surprising at all. And in fact, in 2008, at the Bucharest summit, when NATO announced that it was going to bring Ukraine into the alliance, Putin made it unequivocally clear that he would destroy Ukraine before he let that happen. And what is now happening in Ukraine, tragically I might add, is that the Russians are effectively destroying Ukraine. But this should not be a surprise to any realist, because any realist understands that this is the way great powers behave. Whether that's good or bad is an issue that we can discuss at great length, but it is a basic fact of life in international politics.